So, have any of you ever thought something to be true, like for your whole life, and then realized much later, like decades later, that something you thought was actually not the case or like the complete opposite? I feel like this is what happened to me. So I'm going to try my best to explain because it involves like my family and like relatives and extended family and whatnot. So, or I should say mom, grandma, grandpa, that sort of thing. So my mother was born and raised in Indonesia in the island of Java. And so was my dad. And my mother's parents were born and raised in China in the province of Fujian. And my dad's parents, I believe, had been in Indonesia for at least one generation, but the ancestors are also from China. So going back to my mother, she was born and raised in Indonesia, and she and her siblings spoke one of the dialects of the Fujian province. So my mother's parents, both from Fujian, but spoke two different dialects. So my grandmother had to learn my grandfather's dialect. And so that became the main dialect that they spoke in their house with my mother and all of her siblings. And since they were raised in Indonesia, my mother and her siblings, they went to a Chinese school, and that's where they learned Mandarin, but they didn't learn it very well. It was just like the secondary language that they learned in school. But also because they were living in Indonesia, they learned the Javanese dialect. So my mom, growing up, spoke the Fujian dialect with her family, and then eventually they started speaking more and more of the Javanese dialect because they lived in Indonesia. And then she met my father. They moved to the United States, and they had me and my sister. And somehow they decided that in America, not in Indonesia, not in China, but in America, they would speak Mandarin to their kids. So remember, that's not my mother or my father's primary language. It's not their first language. And so they spoke Mandarin to us. Now, my sister and I, being from the United States, being raised here, once we started school, we were put in the English as a second language class for I'm not sure how long because we didn't speak English when we started school. And now I can't even say I'm bilingual. So Chinese was my first language. And I always kind of went through all the last few years thinking, man, I wish our mom and our dad would have pushed us a little bit more, would have tried to hold on to this language so that we would be fluent in another major language. And I sort of put a little blame on them, like why didn't you push for it? Why weren't you a little bit more persistent? And our mom said, I was busy learning English, so I couldn't really when you came home and you started speaking more English, then I just kind of was learning English. So it just became the language that we spoke at home. And I remember while we made a trip to China last year, me and my husband and our two kids, and I was forced to dig deep and communicate in Mandarin. It was such a struggle, but I still remember a lot of the vocabulary. And I went to visit my mom a couple days ago, and we were talking about this, and I thought, oh my gosh, I had this epiphany that the fact that she was able to use this kind of third language that she learned to teach her kids how to speak, and the fact that I was even able to speak any Chinese at all is kind of a miracle. So now I realize that it was almost impossible for her to teach us this language, and somehow she did. It wasn't even her primary language. So I think about it, and I think it's so awesome that my mom speaks English because she moved here, Then she speaks Indonesian, she speaks Javanese, she speaks Mandarin, and she speaks a Fujian dialect. So 5 languages in all. And I speak one and a little bit of another. And so I just thought it was interesting that I went through all my life thinking one way, which was how come my mom didn't, you know, force us to continue speaking this language at home? Well, I mean, it really wasn't her dominant language. So I thought that was interesting. So now it's kind of up to me to figure out how to relearn the language. Yeah, kind of interesting.